Okay, so, a bunch of you flagged something really interesting from the Forged Act, Section 306 to be precise. Specifically, this recommendation on alternative capability-based pricing for non-traditional defense contractors. What a mouthful, right? But super important, and that's why we're doing this deep dive. We want to get to the bottom of this, figure out what it means for defense contracting, and for those of you working in this space, what are the practical steps involved in actually, putting this into practice?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It is a pretty big deal. It's kind of a sign of how the DoD wants to do innovation differently. I guess, before we jump in, just a quick level set. When we talk about a non-traditional defense contractor, a NDC, we got to be clear what we're talking about. The definition's actually been around since 2016. U.S. Code Title 10, Section 3014, if you want to look it up. It basically means companies that, well, haven't traditionally had a prime contract with the DoD. So, think of your cutting-edge tech companies, the real innovators out there, maybe software developers, commercial companies, places like that. Businesses that haven't been focused on the traditional defense world.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Makes sense. And so this whole Section 306, it seems like it tackles this really core issue, like the way DoD prices things now, those old school cost-based methods, they might not work so well with these NDCs, right?
Hey.
I was reading that and it kind of blew my mind. Some of these pricing models go all the way back to like the 1940s. It's a different world now. It's like trying to use the accounting principles for, I don't know, building a tank to figure out the value of some complex new algorithm. Just doesn't quite fit, does it?
You're absolutely right. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole sometimes. And yeah, people have been talking about the downsides of this rigid cost-plus contracting forever. I mean, there's a stack of GAO reports over the years pointing this out. And there's this growing feeling that it actually pushes NDCs away from working with the DoD. The Defense Science Board, for example, they've done these studies showing how, just focusing on auditable costs, the stuff that's easy to put on a spreadsheet, it misses the real value that a lot of these NDCs bring. They're all about speed, they've got commercially proven tech, and they can adapt quickly. All those things are hard to put a dollar figure on using those old ways of doing things.
Gotcha. So it sounds like this isn't like a brand new idea then. There's a history here.
Exactly. There have been some, well, baby steps, I guess you could say, to change things. Like in 2018, the National Defense Authorization Act, that brought in some more flexibility with things like other transaction authorities, or OTAs for short. And the idea with those was to make it easier for the DoD to work with these non-traditional companies. But even with OTAs, the big question remained, how do you actually put a price on innovation? How do you do it fairly? Well, that's where Section 306 of FLS 5618 really comes in. This bill, Senator Wicker introduced it late 2024. It kind of builds on those earlier efforts. It takes what we've learned and tries to refine things, pulls in ideas from things like innovation.defense.gov. You've probably seen that. And it lines up with what the GAO has been saying. We need to move towards valuing things differently when we're talking about NDCs. So yeah, it's a natural progression.
Okay, so for everyone listening, I bet you're all thinking, what the heck is this capability-based pricing anyway? Like, what does Section 306 actually let agency heads do differently?
The big shift here, it's about how we think. It's a whole new perspective. So Section 306, it lets agency heads use different ways of analyzing things. It's not just about costs anymore. It's about the capability. What can this product or service from an NDC actually do? How does it help the mission? That's where the focus is, on that value.
So instead of just like counting pennies and looking at expenses, the idea is to figure out, what's this tech really going to do for us? How much is that impact worth? Interesting. I see the logic there. But for the folks out there in the defense world, the ones buying this stuff, why should they care about this change? What's in it for them?
Well, let's break it down. There are some pretty compelling benefits. First off, it's about fair pricing. They call it product fitness. Basically, the price you pay should match how well that product or service actually meets the needs of the mission. It's like you're paying for the right tool for the job at a price that reflects its value in that specific situation, not just how much it costs to make. The second thing, it's about recognizing all the expertise and investment that NDCs bring in. Often these companies have poured tons of their own resources into developing these amazing technologies. So by recognizing that, the hope is to encourage more of this innovation. If companies feel like their unique contributions are actually valued, they'll be more likely to partner with the DoD, right?
I can see that. If you spend your own time and money building something truly groundbreaking, you want to be paid for the results, not just the individual parts.
Exactly. And the third point, it's about working with how these NDCs actually do business. A lot of them operate way differently than your typical defense contractor. So by allowing this capability-based pricing, the hope is that DoD investments can be more, scalable and sustainable. It could lead to solutions that are just more efficient and adaptable in the long run. Then there's the whole cost-saving thing. If a new technology can get the job done faster, better, or with less, that's got to be worth something, right? That value needs to be part of the pricing. It's about getting the most bang for your buck, basically. And finally, and this is a big one, this approach aims to bring the military users into the process. Their needs and their experience, it becomes a bigger part of figuring out how valuable something is and therefore how much it's worth.
Okay, that all sounds pretty great.
Right.
But I'm sure there are some potential downsides, too. It can't all be sunshine and roses. What kind of challenges could come up with this new system?
You bet. There are definitely things to watch out for. I mean, one big worry is, subjectivity. Trying to put a value on capability, it can get a bit squishy. You might end up overvaluing some fancy new tech that hasn't really proven itself in the real world, and that could mean inflated costs. Another challenge, and this is a practical one, you often don't have a lot of cost data to work with when you're dealing with NDCs. They haven't been doing business with the government for ages, so they might not have these super detailed auditable cost records. And that can make it tougher to figure out the financial risks, and it can complicate oversight.
That's a really good point. If you don't have that historical cost data, how do you, as a contracting officer or a program manager, know you're getting a good deal? How do you assure everyone that taxpayer money is being spent responsibly?
Precisely. And then there's the whole issue of, fairness. The traditional defense contractors, they've been playing by a different set of rules for decades. They might feel like this NDC-focused pricing gives the new kids an unfair advantage. And, there's some validity to that concern. It could skew the playing field. And then there's the process itself. Evaluating capabilities, especially if it's not done clearly and consistently, it could get super complex and time-consuming. It might actually slow things down, which, defeats the whole purpose of trying to be more agile and innovative. And the last thing is, you could end up with different agencies doing things differently, inconsistent application across the DoD, and that could mean huge price differences for essentially the same capability depending on who's doing the buying.
Okay, so yeah, there are some real implementation hurdles here. But, reading through the recommendation, it does seem like they've thought about some of these potential downsides, right? What kind of guidance do they give to try and mitigate these issues?
Right. And that's the good thing. They're not just ignoring these problems. To avoid that subjective overvaluation, they really stress the need for standardized value metrics. The idea is to have a more objective and consistent way to measure how much something's worth. And to deal with the lack of cost data, they suggest requiring these baseline financial disclosures from NDCs. At least that gives you a starting point. And to level the playing field with traditional contractors, the idea is to offer those parallel pricing options where it makes sense. It's about keeping things fair. And to avoid bogging everyone down in endless evaluations, there's a big emphasis on training people to do these analyses quickly and efficiently. And finally, to make sure everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet, the recommendation pushes for clear, department-wide guidelines on how to do capability-based pricing.
So it's not just, hey, value capability. It's more like, here are the tools and frameworks you need to actually do that properly and fairly. So thinking about everyone in the DoD listening who's going to be most affected by this change.
Well, a few groups come to mind right away. Obviously, agency heads. They're the ones setting the direction, making sure this gets implemented right. Contracting officers, their jobs are going to change a lot. They need new skills. They can't just rely on those cost spreadsheets anymore. It's about understanding and negotiating based on capability. The whole acquisition workforce, they'll have to adapt, learn how to work with this new data, and of course the military users. Their input is crucial here. They're the ones who will be using this stuff, so they need to be a big part of defining what's valuable and what's not.
And what about the folks in the, let's call it the old guard of the defense industry, or maybe the folks in oversight roles? What are their thoughts going to be on this? Any pushback?
There's always going to be different opinions. The traditional contractors, they might be worried, that this is giving an unfair advantage to the NDCs. The DoD auditors, they love their cost structures. And they might get a little uneasy with the less emphasis on those traditional numbers. They're all about accountability. And they might see this as a risk. And then you've got the folks on Capitol Hill watching the budget. They're going to want to understand how we're justifying these expenses without those detailed cost breakdowns. They've got to make sure things are fiscally responsible. And they need to show the taxpayers they're getting value for their money.
So for the DoD to really pull this off, it sounds like they'll need to put some resources behind it, build some new infrastructure and expertise, right? What are the key areas for investment?
Yeah, for sure. The recommendation talks about this. They need funding to develop those standardized tools we discussed, right? The things that make these evaluations more objective. And training, tons of training. Contracting officers, acquisition staff, even the military users, they all need to learn how to do these capability-based assessments. And they might even need to bring in some new people with specific expertise, folks who understand how to value these new technologies and these different business models. It's a big undertaking, but it could be really transformative.
So, for those of you who will be responsible for making this happen, how do you measure success? What are the key signs that this is working as intended?
They actually lay out some specific goals. One big one is the number of contracts going to NDCs. They want to see a 15% increase there. And they also want the whole procurement process to be faster, like 20% faster from start to finish. And of course, in the end, it all comes down to results, right? Cost savings, capability gains. They're aiming for at least a 10% improvement there. And they'll be tracking all of this stuff every year.
So, yeah, some pretty clear targets there. Now, before we wrapped up, the recommendation did mention some other approaches that were considered, right? Like, what were some of the other options on the table?
Yeah, it's interesting. One idea was to stick with the cost plus model, but tweak it for NDCs. Like try to adjust it to better fit their unique cost structures. It would be less of a drastic change. And another idea, and this one got some attention from innovation.defense.gov, was to build the digital pricing platform. The thinking there was maybe you could use tech to make those value assessments more standardized and transparent, maybe even bypass the need for legislative changes like Section 306.
So, a few different paths they could have taken, but in the end, they landed on Section 306. Okay, let's sum this up for everyone listening. What's the big takeaway here? What's the core message about this whole push for capability-based pricing? And what should you be thinking about as you start to implement this?
The bottom line is, Section 306 is a really big shift. The DoD, they want to change how they engage with companies outside that traditional defense bubble. It's about recognizing the potential of new technology, even if it doesn't fit neatly into the old ways of doing things. It's about valuing the impact, the outcome, not just the line items on a cost spreadsheet. And the hope is this could open the door to all sorts of cutting-edge tech, make things more efficient, and ultimately make us safer.
But as we've talked about, it's not going to be easy.
Nope. You've got to plan carefully. You've got to build those standardized metrics. You've got to train your people. And you've got to bring everyone along, address the concerns, answer the questions. This is about more than just changing a few rules. It's about changing how we think about innovation and value.
This has been a great deep dive into Section 306. Hopefully, everyone listening has a better sense of what it's all about and what it'll take to make it work. As you think about this whole shift in how we do procurement, think about the bigger picture. How might this impact not just your own work, but the entire defense industry, the pace of technology, even beyond this Forged Act? It's a big change with some pretty significant ripple effects. Definitely something to keep your eye on. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.